In this episode, I'm going to show you how to get a telescope onto a telescope mount. In this case, I just have a 12.5-pound telescope that I can easily put onto this manual mount by either slipping the Vixen style dovetail into the Vixen slot or by putting the lower lip on the edge and then pushing it in and then tightening these screws. But what if your telescope weighs 30 pounds? Well, let me show you how to safely get a 30-pound telescope onto an equatorial mount, and also I'll show you some safe ways to move around a very heavy telescope. If you own a heavy Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, mine weighs 30 pounds, but a C14, for example, weighs 45 pounds. Then you want to find a table that is high enough that will allow you to place the telescope with the front of the telescope pointed down, and it will be able to reach the saddle of your mount. Then take the counterweights off the counterweight shaft and turn the saddle until it's perpendicular with the floor. And then pick up the telescope and carefully place it with the front of the telescope pointed down and edge it into the saddle. And then once it's in the saddle, tighten it down. And then you can put the counterweights back on. And then when you're sure everything is secured, you can remove the table and then put the telescope mount back into the home position, pointed towards the north or south celestial pole. Now let me tell you how to move around a heavy telescope like a Dobsonian or a heavy telescope on a dual fork mount. One thing you can do is you can put your Dobsonian on a hand truck, and that way you can wheel the whole thing out without having to take the tube out of the base. If you have a lip or a threshold to get over and a hand truck is not practical, another thing you can do is you can put your Dobsonian base on caster wheels, make sure they have stops on them, and that way you can move it around. I can move my Dobsonian as one piece a short distance, and I could keep it on a wheelie bar like this one, but I don't, because they do make wheelie bars specifically for Dobsonians, but this one is not. I would just take these tension knobs off and take the tube out and move the base first and then put the tube in it. If you own a heavy refractor, this one weighs 27 pounds with everything on it. You can just slide it onto the dovetail like this. It's not easy, but that's how I do it. But another thing you could do is you can take the tube out of the rings and just first install the dovetail with the rings, which would take a lot of the weight off. I think it would be about 10 pounds maybe. And then the tube would weigh a lot less, and then it'd be easier to put the tube in the rings and tighten the rings. That's another way to get a refractor onto your mount. Actually, I said refractors, but the same principle would apply to a reflector. I don't own any reflectors that are mounted to a dovetail bar, but if you do, you could also take your reflector out of the dovetail bar and tube rings. Put the tube ring and dovetail on first, and then put the reflector into the rings and tighten it. Pro tip: I marked my dovetail bar with nail polish where the bar should go onto the saddle to be perfectly balanced, so that way I don't have to hold this scary telescope while trying to slide the dovetail on the saddle. For heavier telescopes that have tripod legs like this Meade LX90, you can get a JMI wheelie bar. They were bought by Farpoint, and there are other companies that make telescope mount moving devices such as Scope Buggy and you put the telescope on that, and that's how you move around a heavy dual fork mount or even a single fork mount or an equatorial mount with a heavy telescope on it. When transporting your telescope on a wheelie bar, always strap it down first. I use these straps. They're sturdy enough and they're easy to use. They just have one clip. Just clip it around the telescope and then underneath the wheelie bar. And I use 3 of them. So those are some ways to get a heavy telescope onto your mount and to move around a heavy telescope or Dobsonian. Hope you found this useful. I'll see you in the next one. Dark skies forever. Sula signing off.